The Dwarves, Part 1. Prologue. Northern Pass, Stone Gateway to the Fifthling Kingdom. Late summer, 5199th solar cycle. Pale fog filled the canyons and valleys of the Grey Range. The Dragon's Tongue, Great Blade, and other peaks towered defiantly above the mist, tips raised toward the evening sun. Slowly, as if afraid of the jagged peaks, the ball of fire sank into the sky, bathing the northern pass in waning red light. Glandolin Hammerstrike, of the clan of the Striking Hammers, recovered his breath. Leaning back against the roughly hewn wall of the watchtower, he cupped his hand to his bushy brown eyebrows and shaded his eyes from the unaccustomed light. The ascent had been grueling, and his close-woven chainmail, 2 axes, and shield weighed heavy on his aged legs. There was no one younger to stand watch in his stead. Only a few orbits previously, the 9 clans of the Fifthling Kingdom had been attacked in their underground halls. Many had lost their lives in the battle, but the young and inexperienced were the first to fall. Then came the sickness. No one knew where it had sprung from, but it preyed on the dwarves, sapping their strength, clouding their vision, and enfeebling their hands. And it was so that Glandolin, despite his age, was guarding the gateway that night. 2 vast slabs of solid rock, erected by Vrockus, god and creator of the dwarves, stemmed the tide of invading beasts. For some, the sight of the imposing gateway was not enough of a deterrent. Bleached bones and twisted scraps of armor were all that remained of them now. The solitary sentry unhooked a leather pouch from his belt and poured cool water down his parched throat. A few drops spilled out of the corners of his mouth, flowing through his black beard. Elegant braids, the work of untold hours, hung from his chin and rested on his chest like delicate cords. Glandolin replaced the pouch, took his weapons from his belt, and laid them on the parapet. The steel axe heads jangled melodiously against the sculpted rock, carved like the rest of the stronghold from the mountain's flesh. A ray of sunlight glowed red on the polished inscriptions, illuminating the runes and symbols that promised their bearer protection, and a sure aim, and long life. Glandolin turned to the north, his brown eyes sweeping the mountain pass, 30 paces across, that led from the watchtower into the outer lands. No one knew what lay there. In times gone by, human kings had dispatched adventurers in all directions, but the expeditions were rarely successful, and the few who returned to the gateway brought orcs in their wake. He scanned the pass carefully. The beasts learned nothing from their defeats. Their vicious, choleric minds compelled them to throw themselves against the dwarves' defenses. They were bent on destroying anyone and anything in their path, for their creator, the Dark Lord Tion, had made them that way. The raids were conducted in blind fury. Raging and screaming, the beasts would scale the walls. From the first tinges of dawn light until the setting of sun, armor would be cleaved from flesh, and flesh from bone. A tide of black, dark green, and yellowy brown blood would lap against the impregnable gates, while battering rams and projectiles shattered as they hit the stone. The children of Vrockus suffered casualties, deaths, and crippling injuries too, yet it never occurred to them to quarrel with their fate. They were dwarves, Girdlegard's staunchest defenders. And yet we were almost defeated. Glandolin's thoughts turned again to the strange beings that had invaded the underground halls, killing many of his kinfolk. No one had seen them approach. Outwardly, they resembled elves, tall, slim, and graceful, but as warriors they were savage and ruthless. Glandolin was almost certain that the creatures were not elves. There was no love lost between the dwarves and their pointy-eared neighbors. Vrockus and Citalia, goddess and creator of the elves, had ordained the races with common loathing from the moment of their birth. Their differences had resulted in feuds, the occasional skirmish, and sometimes death, but never war. Then again, he thought critically, I might be wrong. Perhaps the elves hate us enough to draw arms against us, or maybe they're after our gold. A bitter northerly wind whistled round the mountain tops, gusting through Glandulin's braided beard. Suddenly his brow furrowed angrily, and his nostrils detected a stench that offended the core of his being. Orcs. Spilled blood, excrement, and filth. That was the perfume of orcs, mixed with the rancid odor of their greasy apparel. They basted their armor with fat, believing that the dwarves' axes would slither over the metal and leave them unharmed. No amount of fat will save them. Glandulin did not wait for the ragged banners and rusty spears to appear over the final incline of the path. Standing on tiptoe, he placed his calloused hands on the coarse wooden handle of the bellows. A low drone vibrated through the shafts and galleries of the Fifthling Kingdom. The dwarf worked two bellows in rotation to produce a constant stream of air. Gathering in volume, the drone became a single, piercing note, loud enough to rouse the soundest of sleepers. Now, as so often in their history, the Fifthlings were being summoned to fulfill their noble duty as Gurlagard's protectors. Sweating from the exertion, Glandulin glanced over his shoulder. Tion's beasts had formed a wide front and were marching on the gateway, more numerous than ever before. Elves would have fled to the woods, and man's heart would have stopped at the sight of the monstrous hordes. The dwarf stood his ground. The attack on the gateway came as no surprise to Glandulin, but the timing was unsettling. The coming battle would stretch the dwarves' resources more than usual. More bloodshed, more death. The defending warriors lined up on the battlements on either side of the gateway, their movements slow, some lurching rather than walking, weak fingers wrapped loosely around the hafts of their axes. The band of dwarves stumbling to the defense of the gates numbered no more than 100 brave souls. 1,000 would have been too few. Glandulin's watch was at an end. He was needed elsewhere. Don't forsake us, Fracas. We're outnumbered, he whispered, unable to wrest his eyes from the stinking stream of orcs that poured along the path. Grunting, shouting, and jostling, they headed for the gates. The bare rock cast back their bestial cries, the echo mingling with their belligerent chants. The strident noises jangled in his mind, and it seemed to him that the beasts had somehow changed. There was a palpable air of confidence about the raging, shouting mob. For the first time, he was afraid of the beasts. What he saw next did nothing to ease his mind. Scanning the ranks of the invading army, his gaze fell on a cluster of lofty fir trees. Since childhood, he had watched them thrive and grow on the otherwise barren slopes. Now they were sickly and dying. The trees are faring no better than we. Glandulin's thoughts were with his wounded and ailing friends. What strange forces are these? Your children need you, Vrockus. He prayed briefly, gathering his axes from the parapet. With growing dread, he pressed his lips to the runes. Don't abandon me now. He enjoined the blades softly before turning and hurrying down the steps to join the small troop of defenders. He reached them just as the first wave of beasts struck the wall. Quivering arrows rained down on the dwarves. Ladders were thrust against the walls, and orcs hastened to scale the wobbly rungs, while others set down their catapults and launched burning projectiles to reinforce the bombardment. Leather pouches filled to the brim with paraffin spluttered through the air and burst on impact, covering everything around them in an oily liquid and setting it ablaze. The first salvo was aimed too low, but the dark hordes were undeterred by the sight of their front line burning in a storm of fire. Nothing, not the battery of stones, nor the torrent of molten ore, could check their rapacious zeal. For every orc that was slain, 5 new aggressors scaled the walls. This time, they were determined to breach the defenses. This time, the gateway was destined to fall. "Look out!" Glandolin ran to the aid of a dwarf whose shoulder had been pierced by an arrow. One of Tion's minions, a stunted creature with thick tusks and a broad nose, had seized his chance and squeezed through the embrasure, hauling himself over the parapet and onto the battlements. Dwarf and orc stared at each other in silence. The clamor of voices, the hissing of arrows, the clatter of axes faded to an indistinct buzz. Glandolin's ears were tuned to his opponent's heavy breath. The red-veined eyes, buried deep within the head, flicked nervously from side to side. The dwarf knew exactly what was going on inside that creature's mind. The orc, the first of its kind to have set foot on the battlement, could scarcely believe its good fortune. A foul odor arose from the thick gray layer of tallow that coated its armor plating. The smell filled Glandolin's nostrils, drawing his attention back to the battle. Shrieking, he threw himself at the beast. His shield jabbed smartly downward, shattering his opponent's foot, while he lunged with his axe from above. The blade smashed through the unarmored flesh around the armpit. The orc's arm sliced cleanly at the joint, fell to the stony floor. Dark green blood sprayed upward from the open wound. The orc let out a high-pitched scream, from which he was rewarded by a mighty stroke perpendicular to the neck. "Tell your kinsfolk I'm anxious to make their acquaintance." Glandolin gave the dying brute a final shove and sent him tumbling against the parapet, where he took the next invader with him as he fell. They vanished over the side and plummeted to the ground. With any luck, they'll crash half a dozen others, thought Glandolin. From then on, the enemy gave him no respite. Running from one end of the parapet to the other, splintering helms, cleaving skulls, ducking arrows, and evading firebombs, he felled orc after orc. Darkness was descending on the stone gateway, but Glandolin was untroubled by the fading light. Even the thickest gloom could be penetrated by sharp dwarven eyes. But each blow and every movement took its toll on his weary arms, shoulders, and legs. "Raucus, grant us a moment to gather our forces," he coughed, rubbing his braids across his face to free his eyes of blood. The dwarven deity took pity on his children. A fanfare of horns and bugles bade the hordes cease their assault, and the orcs complied, pulling away from the walls.
If you're enjoying this story, please remember to click the like button and subscribe. Also, follow me on Patreon for early access, and if you want extra rewards, join my Patreon Fae Fam. Thanks for listening.